Power and blood. These two obsessions define the long reign of Henry VIII. For almost 4 decades, the name Henry was not just a title, it was the embodiment of a nation, a declaration of supreme authority, and a constant threat to anyone who dared to challenge his will. Every action, from building mighty war fleets to executing his own wives, carried the hallmark of cold calculation and an unshakable belief in his divine right. Yet glory, no matter how bright, could not ward off the inevitable decay of time and biology. As the severe winter of 1547 cloaked London in a damp, chilling fog, death began to creep into Whitehall Palace, not as a silent assassin, but as a revolt of the powerful body he once commanded. The king's decline was a private tragedy, played out in secret before a handful of doomed physicians and servants. Publicly, royal proclamations maintained the necessary lie of a hale and hearty monarch, a fiction vital for national stability. But inside, the truth was grotesque. The Henry VIII of 1547, lying motionless on his vast, dark-draped bed, was a distorted shadow of the man once renowned across Europe for his vigor and athleticism. Courtiers whispered fearfully of the dying lion, knowing that even near his end, his claw remained sharp enough to end a life with a final, trembling stroke of the pen. His physical transformation was a grim spectacle. His body had ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, a mountainous mass requiring special mechanical devices just to shift his weight on the enormous bed. His once handsome face was bloated and distorted, his eyes sunken deep into flesh that had taken on a sickly yellow hue. The true horror, however, lay in his legs, where suppurating ulcers had turned his lower body into a battlefield of putrefaction. The ulcers on the king's legs caused excruciating pain, and worse, emitted a foul, overpowering stench. While the servants constantly burned expensive incense and foreign spices, the odor of decay remained dominant, forcing those in attendance to perfect the art of silent breath-holding, pressing perfumed handkerchiefs tightly against their faces to perform their duties without vomiting, an offense punishable by death. The royal physicians were helpless against what modern medicine suggests was a lethal cocktail of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, chronic gout, and possibly osteomyelitis. The sheer physical agony exacerbated his mental state. Henry's legendary temper had devolved into unpredictable explosive rages, interspersed with periods of confused lethargy. In his rare moments of lucidity, he faced the ultimate betrayal, the failure of his own flesh. The absolute power of the crown was useless against biological disintegration. Court records noted his increasing paranoia, muttering about the ghosts of executed rivals and crying out the names of his long-dead wives. The king's physical collapse did nothing to halt the frantic political machinations. Instead, it created a dangerous power vacuum that courtiers rushed to fill. The 9-year-old heir, Prince Edward, was the prize. His minority guaranteed a regency council, and the battle to control it was raging between two powerful religious factions. On one side stood the conservative Catholic faction, led by Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who aimed to maintain the Church of England close to its old Catholic roots. Opposing them was the reformist Protestant faction, led by Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and crucially, the young Prince Edward's maternal uncle. His familial link to the heir gave him an unassailable advantage. Inside the sick room, Henry, though struggling to hold a pen, was acutely aware of these maneuvers. He was accustomed to being the ultimate controller, and he was determined to maintain that grip until his last breath. Execution orders were still being signed, a final demonstration of his terrifying authority. In a final, ruthless display, the elderly Duke of Norfolk was sentenced to death for treason. Henry believed Norfolk posed a threat to Edward's succession. The execution was set. This act, sanctioned by a king on the brink of death, was a chilling reminder that no one in the Tudor court was safe.
The rapid deterioration of the king's health was the realm's most guarded secret. Royal proclamations continued to describe Henry as hale and hearty, contrasting starkly with the macabre scene inside the royal chamber. The enormous bed was draped in black, the smell of decay and incense mingling, and at the center lay the monumental figure of the man who had once symbolized England's vigor. The king's screams were often heard echoing through the stone corridors of Whitehall. The pain from the ulcers was so intense that even the slightest movement could trigger paroxysms of agony. His physicians, desperate and incompetent, applied every futile remedy in their limited arsenal, from poultices of boiled onions to powdered human skull, barbaric measures that only added to his torment. Only the liberal use of opium offered relief, but it further clouded the king's already tormented mind. The decline of the body brought on a profound religious crisis. Henry, who had audaciously broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, was now tormented by doubts regarding his soul and eternal judgment. During sleepless nights, racked by throbbing pain and terrifying hallucinations, Henry oscillated wildly in his religious leanings. One day, he might demand traditional Catholic rites, craving the comfort of the Mass and confession. The next, he would reaffirm Protestant principles, fearing the old ceremonies were superstitious idolatry. Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, observed this crisis with intense anxiety. Henry's waking nightmares, where he cried out for the ghosts of his victims, demonstrated that his conscience had superseded his earthly power. The silent figures of Anne Boleyn and Thomas More were said to stand at the foot of his bed, acting as his eternal jury. In his brief lucid moments, Henry obsessed over his will. He was determined to control the future of his dynasty from beyond the grave. The extensive 30-page document meticulously laid out the succession, first to Edward, then to Mary, and finally to Elizabeth. This careful planning also established a regency council of 16 men to rule until Edward came to age, an attempt to balance power and prevent any single nobleman, particularly Edward Seymour, from gaining too much influence. The concealment of Henry's condition had become a sophisticated art of deception. The physicians, well aware that their failure to save the king could result in their own disgrace or execution, worked in a frenzy. They applied hot irons to his skin to rouse him or draw out toxins, and forced bitter medicinal concoctions down his throat. This process was conducted under the strictest secrecy. Archbishop Cranmer personally controlled access to the royal bedchamber. The purpose was not merely dignity, but strategic necessity. News of the king's imminent death could trigger premature power grabs or even foreign invasion. Even Queen Catherine Parr, his sixth and surviving wife, was kept at a distance during certain critical periods. January 27, 1547, marked the king's irreversible collapse. His exhausted body finally surrendered. Witnesses recorded that Henry suffered a violent seizure so powerful that attendants had to physically restrain him to prevent injury. When the episode passed, a deafening silence descended. Henry tried to speak, but his voice was choked. His right side was partially paralyzed, clear evidence of a massive stroke, a fatal blow that Tudor medicine was helpless to counter. The physicians continued their frantic, futile treatments, but they knew his time was measured in hours. The royal chamber became a scene of profound grief and decay. As Henry's bodily functions failed, teams of servants worked in shifts, managing the increasingly distasteful tasks of cleaning and moving the king's massive body. The stench intensified to overwhelming levels, forcing the windows to be flung open despite the freezing winter air, whenever the king lost consciousness in a desperate attempt to cleanse the infected atmosphere. The ulcers on his legs had grown so severe that bone was reportedly visible through the necrotic tissue. Henry's torment was not merely physical. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and in those lucid moments he expressed a profound and growing terror concerning his imminent judgment before God. The king who had executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of common subjects now faced his own mortality with increasing dread. An attendant's diary recorded Henry muttering prayers and begging forgiveness in his sleep, a stark final contradiction to the unyielding autocrat who had reshaped England's religious landscape through sheer force of will.
Archbishop Cranmer was urgently summoned to the royal bedside as Henry's breathing became increasingly labored. This was the moment of truth, not just for the king's soul, but for the religious future of England. Cranmer leaned close to the king's ear. Unable to ask for speech or confession, Cranmer instead made a profound request. Cranmer asked Henry if he placed his faith in Christ alone, rather than in the external religious ceremonies he had once valued. All ambiguity had to end. Cranmer asked the king to answer with his very last possible action: "Squeeze my hand." The entire room held its breath. Henry gathered his residual strength. He squeezed Cranmer's hand clearly before slipping into his final coma. This final action has often been cited as evidence of a deathbed conversion, a moment where Henry seemingly cast aside worldly power for personal salvation. King Henry VIII died before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even in death, his enormous physical presence dominated the chamber. His corpse was a grotesque monument to excess and suffering. The official cause was simply recorded as natural decay, though modern analysis points to a combination of heart failure, sepsis from the infected wounds, and diabetic complications. More remarkable than the death itself was the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that followed. The Privy Council, masterminded by Edward Seymour, suppressed the news of the king's passing for 3 full days. This delay was crucial. It allowed Edward Seymour and his Protestant faction to consolidate power with ruthless efficiency. Secret meetings were held, key fortresses were secured, and potential rivals were neutralized. When the bells of London finally tolled on January 31st to mark the monarch's passing, Edward Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively ruling England in his nephew's name. The disposal of Henry VIII's remains presented unique logistical challenges. Court records document that the royal corpse began decomposing at an alarming speed, likely due to the advanced infections already present. Embalmers worked frantically, removing the internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs and preservatives. Even these experts were reportedly shocked by the state of Henry's internal organs, particularly his diseased liver and engorged heart. Henry's coffin required custom construction to accommodate his huge girth, reportedly measuring almost twice the width of a noble's casket. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, the lead-lined coffin actually split under pressure from the gases building within the decomposing body, leaking fluids onto the floor of the chapel. This macabre detail was hastily covered up, but accounts suggest that dogs licked at the seepage, creating a final grotesque indignity for a king obsessed with majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th was the regime's final opportunity to display Henry's power even in death. Effigies depicted the king as he had appeared in his prime, a deliberate counterpoint to the bloated figure sealed within. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son and heir. The enduring image of Henry, the broad-shouldered embodiment of power, crafted by court painters like Hans Holbein, stood in contrast to the disease-ravaged body sealed beneath Windsor's stone floor. Henry's will was his final attempt to control the future from beyond the grave. The document meticulously laid out the succession, first to his son Edward, then to his daughter Mary, and finally to Elizabeth. This clear line of succession was eventually followed exactly as Henry specified. More immediately significant was his establishment of a regency council of 16 men to govern collectively. However, his careful plan was quickly undermined. Within days of Henry's death, Edward Seymour outmaneuvered his fellow councillors and was named Lord Protector. The speed with which Henry's wishes were subverted demonstrated the limitations of even a king's power once death removed his fearsome presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to fascinate historians. His symptoms have been retrospectively diagnosed as evidence of type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. Henry's medical records reveal increasingly desperate and bizarre treatments, from the application of live pigeons cut in half and placed on his festering wounds to experimental concoctions containing gold and pulverized precious stones. These expensive but useless remedies reflect both the limits of Tudor medicine and the extraordinary measures taken for a patient of Henry's status.
Perhaps most poignant were the personal effects found in the king's chambers after his death. Amidst the expected trappings of royal power, servants discovered a small, locked chest containing more intimate items, a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to be from his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, possibly belonging to Elizabeth. These humanizing details offer a rare glimpse of the man behind the monstrous reputation. Even as his body and mind deteriorated, Henry maintained some connection to personal sentiment. The king's death triggered immediate political realignments. The conservative Catholic forces were abruptly sidelined as Edward Seymour established a decisively Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, having administered the last rites, now accelerated the religious reforms that Henry had approached more cautiously. The first English Book of Common Prayer would be published just 2 years after Henry's death. Henry's complex religious position, having broken with Rome while maintaining many Catholic practices, created an ambiguous legacy that fueled religious conflicts throughout the reigns of all 3 of his children. Henry's death also marked a crucial turning point in Tudor propaganda. Portraits of young Edward VI deliberately echoed his father's iconic stance, depicting the child with the same wide-legged posture and defiant expression. Court ceremonies emphasized continuity. Courtiers were still required to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had shown his father. Beyond the political sphere, Henry's death created a psychological vacuum as much as a political one. Parish records from early 1547 reveal widespread anxiety about the future, with increased reports of prophetic dreams, strange celestial omens, and even alleged ghost sightings. International reactions to Henry's death revealed England's complex position on the European stage. The French ambassador reported that King Francis I genuinely mourned his dear brother of England. Emperor Charles V pragmatically assessed the strategic implications. Even Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry a decade earlier, reportedly offered a mass for the king's soul. The physical space where Henry died, his private chambers in Whitehall Palace, became immediately charged with historical significance. Courtiers reported a reluctance to enter the rooms where the king had suffered his final agonies, with rumors of strange sounds and inexplicable cold spots fueling superstitious fears. Young Edward VI reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed. Henry's medical case represents one of history's most well-documented royal deaths. His physicians kept detailed records of treatments, records that survived because they were preserved as evidence that everything possible had been done to save the king. The failure of these methods demonstrates the limitations faced by even the most advanced medical practitioners of the era. The king's obsession with his posthumous image extended to explicit instructions for his tomb, a massive monument designed to dwarf all other royal burial sites in England. Henry commissioned elaborate designs featuring 40 life-size bronze figures. Ironically, the massive project remained unfinished due to financial constraints, and the planned bronze figures were ultimately melted down during the English Civil War. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death saw a rush to either secure or distance oneself from his legacy. Courtiers who had fallen from favor emerged from hiding, while others who had enjoyed his patronage scrambled to establish new protective relationships. Archives contain poignant correspondence from royal servants suddenly finding themselves without position after decades of service. For many, adaptation proved impossible. The skills required to manage Henry's volatile temperament had little application in the more restrained court of Edward VI.
Most significantly, Henry's death marked the beginning of a critical transition in English governance, from rule by an absolutist monarch whose personal will dominated policy to more collaborative forms of power sharing between crown and nobility. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's intimidating personal authority and relied more heavily on council approval. Henry's final illness became a subject of intense medical retrospection. Modern medical historians have proposed complex diagnoses, including chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, resulting from multiple jousting injuries in his youth, which could explain both his physical deterioration and psychological changes. The disposal of Henry's personal possessions offers a revealing glimpse into Tudor attitudes toward death and remembrance. His final set of nightclothes, stained with bodily fluids, was ceremonially burned under Cranmer's supervision, an act combining practical sanitation with symbolic significance. More valuable items, including his extensive collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were carefully catalogued before being distributed or retained for Edward's education. Henry's death placed his surviving wives and children in precarious positions. Catherine Parr, his widow, maintained a dignified public mourning while swiftly moving to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour. Edward VI, now king, recorded his father's death with disturbing detachment in his journal. Meanwhile, his daughters faced their own challenges. Mary, a committed Catholic, was increasingly alienated by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, just 13, had to navigate court life with extraordinary caution. Both princesses would eventually succeed to the throne Henry had promised them, but the path would prove dangerous. The accounts of Henry's final hours reveal the extraordinary isolation experienced by even the most powerful monarch at the moment of death. Despite being surrounded by attendants, Henry faced his end in essential solitude, separated from others by both his royal status and the uniquely personal nature of death itself. The king, who had commanded absolute obedience, found himself ultimately journeying alone, a poignant reminder of mortality's great leveling power.